Reverend Ralph David Abernathy, author of the book And the Walls Came Tumbling Down. When did you first think that you wanted to write your autobiography?
Oh, about 4 or 5 years ago, I decided that I would write my autobiography, and I have been working on it ever since then, not straight out, but for given periods. I would write, and I would leave it, and go back to it and come back to it. And so I wanted to write this book.
You happy about it?
Yes, I'm very, very happy about it. I'm so pleased. It is a good-looking book, and it is a good book. And it is more than 600 pages of my life story. I am the son of a farmer, and I grew up in Linden, Alabama, Marengo County, the heart of the Black Belt. And my grandfather and my grandmother were born slaves. And I just wanted to tell my story and to show the youth of America, the children of America, that you may be locked in poverty and you may have a difficult time surviving, but you can be what my dear friend Martin Luther King often quoted: if you can't be a pine on the top of the hill, be a scrub in the valley, but be the best little scrub by the side of the hill. Be a bush if you can't be a tree. And so you can be something and somebody if you do not lose your sense of worth and dignity and somebodyness.
I want to start with the last part of the book first, the epilogue. And in there you described that in 1980 you supported Ronald Reagan for the presidency. Why'd you do that?
Well, I did it for the simple reason, first, I didn't believe President Carter could lead the nation forward at that particular juncture. He is a good man, but I just didn't feel that you could run the country as he had ran the state of Georgia, and he didn't have around him the staff that was able to do that. And secondly, I supported Ronald Reagan because he was talking about jobs and income, and I went on with that side of my political life, and thirdly, I believe that young black people should participate in both parties. The Republican Party has too long ignored us, and the Democratic Party has taken us for granted. And so since all of my colleagues in Atlanta and various places across the country were supporting the Democratic Party, I felt that I should support Ronald Reagan. And so I understood very, very clearly that it is a policy in politics, according to President Gerald Ford, that you reward your friends, but you punish your enemies. And so I thought I would launch a job program and get help from Mr. Reagan and from the private sector as well as the public sector. You know, the Republicans have most of the money in the country, and I thought I would get that type of help. But he's soon forgotten what I had sought to do to him, or I cannot get through. And one of the distinguished journalists just happened to have been connected with my congregation, and I had to do her grandmother's funeral, and she told me, Dr. Abernathy, what you really should do to get to Mr. Reagan is to get to Mrs. Reagan, and maybe like that you can get through. But Ed Meese and the people surrounded him. I just felt that they never let my calls through and never gave me ample time to explain fully the meaning of the Foundation for Economic Enterprises Development.
Let's go back. I didn't mean to interrupt, but I want to go back so that the audience understands the context. You were asked to come and do a public hold up the hands and endorse President Reagan back during the 1980 campaign, and you did that. Do you remember the city in which you did that?
In Detroit, Michigan.
And you flew up there to do it, and when you got there you had a meeting with the president, and then you walked out and found that some of your other friends were there with you?
Yes, I found that other persons, including Jose Williams, a former staff member of mine at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, had come to join me and endorsing Mr. Reagan. But I had a private conference with Mr. Reagan because I wanted to get the guarantee from him that he wanted me to endorse him and that he would be accessible to me, because I didn't want to just be endorsing a man that I was unable to talk to.
After you endorsed him, the election's over, you tried to reach President Reagan. What happened?
Well, I could not get any further than Ed Meese. And I went out to Palm Spring to say President Gerald Ford, and he was most sympathetic and most kind, and he called the White House while I was there, and he
This
said,
was in '81, right in the first year?
yes, and he said, well, hey, Meese, and I want you to arrange a meeting with the president, and I want to, Ralph Abernathy has suffered greatly because my colleagues didn't like that. You know, they tried to dry up my resources and everything. And he said, well, I want him to be able to talk to the president. And he said, well, I will arrange the meeting and you can be assured. I was in his office at that particular time. I had set up the Foundation for Economic Enterprises Development. It was fully, contributions made to the organization was fully tax deductible. And I had gone through this ordeal. My friend Jane Peterson had worked with me, and he was the executive vice president of the organization. And finally, the meeting was arranged, and it was just about a 5-minute, 10-minute meeting.
With the president?
Yes, and
was he interested?
No, Mr. Meese had told me that he was not interested. Mr. Ford thought that he could call to the White House some millionaires, about 100 of them, and they could give the money that was necessary $100,000, each to the foundation, and take care of one who had suffered so much because I endorsed the president, and Mr. Me said that he could not call anybody to come to the White House, and there were no private sector funds available, and he told me that the public sector write a proposal, and we wrote a proposal, and finally the Department of Transportation, UMTA, finally we received a small grant, and we finally received a small grant from the Department of Labor, and that is all that we received, and that was not enough to sustain the foundation. So the foundation now is not, has no address to receive contributions, but I am working still with the foundation, and James Peterson is working still with the foundation, and hopefully we will get it back operating.
What did you do in 1984? Did you endorse President Reagan for a second term?
No, I decided to go with my friend Jesse Lewis Jackson. Jesse Jackson had expressed the hope and the dream of receiving the nomination of the Democrats. And so naturally he was my former employee and my friend, and so I went to I guess it was somewhere in North Carolina, and when he announced his candidacy, and I supported him all the way. He preached at my church and spoke at the church, and we were able to give him more than $10,000 in an offering for his candidacy, and so that was that, and we were proud to. And he has carried us closer as black people to the White House than any other person. Jesse Jackson is a good man. He's very, very articulate. He has his faults and failures, and as all of us have them. And he has a big ego. But I don't know a president of the United States that has not had a big ego. I guess it takes a big ego to become the president.
In the epilogue, again, you write about the illnesses you've had, and,
yes.
And you talk about the strokes. How many strokes have you had?
I have had 2 small strokes, never a massive stroke. And I have had brain surgery. One of the carotid arteries was clogged, and I went to Johns Hopkins Hospital. My wife took me there, and I had a carotid artery. That artery supplies the blood flow to the brains. There are 2, and I became the 51st person to undergo that microscopic surgery, and it took about 12 hours, and I cannot speak too clearly because of it being clogged. So consequently, when the anesthesiologist came to me and gave me lessons and said, Dr. Abernathy, they call me Dr. A. Dr. A, when you wake up, I want you to wake up talking. And when we ask you to move your right hand, don't move your left hand. And we had you had to prove to us that you understand. When we asked, who's the President of the United States, we want you to say Ronald Reagan. And so consequently, Mr. Reagan did call me and wish me success and everything. And so when I finished with the surgery and the anesthesiologist called me, Dr. A, wake up. I knew and I heard them the first time. But I knew that I would have to spend the rest of my life from my meager earnings and savings paying them for such an operation. And so I just caused them some anxiety. They had to call me the second time. Dr. A, wake up. And I said, I love Jesus. I love Jesus. I love Jesus. And they said, Dr. A, don't say another word because you are running your blood pressure off the cuff. And what was thought to be did not happen. I was to have a black eye, and I was to have be kept in intensive care for 5 or 6 days. But the next morning, I was awakened, and I had a full breakfast, bacon and eggs, and juice, and coffee. And they said, now we are going to get you out of here because you're doing fine. And I called my wife over at the Hopkins Inn, and she said, oh, Ralph, where are you? And are you still pricking and kicking? And I said, I'm back in my room at Johns Hopkins Hospital. And she said, I cannot believe it. They said that you would be there 4 or 5 days in intensive care. But God was good to me, and God be the glory. He is due all the praise. And people across this nation had fasted and prayed for me, my family. And Juanita is a very, very lovely wife, and I'm proud that she is the mother of my 4 lovely children. And she's a great woman, and she's a woman of great intellect. And she is just, I love her.
In the book, we have a picture here that the audience will see of your family. When was this taken?
Oh, that was taken, I guess, a couple of years ago.
Can you tell us who's your daughter here?
Oh, that is David Abernathy is married now to George Bosley. And George Bosley is a high school, I mean not high school, but college schoolmate, and who majored in the movie industry also. David is an actress, but she maintains her name, Abernathy. She's married to a young white man, but she is dedicated to the family. She's the second of our 2 daughters.
This daughter right here.
That is David.
And you said she is married to a white man.
Yes.
Would you tell us the story that you tell in the book about the marriage itself?
Well, it is just a very, very comical thing. The church holds about 2,500 people, and the marriage was scheduled for 11 o'clock, and it was thought that George's mother had a heart attack the previous evening, and it turned out that she just had some gas pains or something like that. But she was in the hospital, and George was to go by and let her check him out and see his tuxedo, and he neglected, as young people will do, to call the church and be in contact with me, and I thought that he might have stood up my daughter. And
How late was he?
yes, he was about 45 minutes late.
So you had a church full of 2,500 people?
Yes, yes, and they were waiting, and Father Jim Nickey from Chicago, Illinois, the chaplain of the O'Hara Airport, had been invited to assist me and marry my daughter, and I was to marry her, but certainly he was to assist me, and I had him go out and assure the people that George was running late, and finally George came, and what a relief it was for me.
All right, in this picture, in addition to Donzale, you have another daughter, and let's see it on the screen, please. There we go. Who is this daughter?
This daughter is Wanderlin. Wanderlin is our oldest daughter. She lives in West Germany, and she is an opera singer. She sang at the wedding of Donzale. She is not married. I chatted recently about being able to see one of my grandchildren before passing on to the other side, my new home. And she said, "Oh, Daddy, I'm not married." And I said, "Well, I would like to see some of my grandchildren." And she said, "Well, what about a surrogate, a grandchild?" And I said, "Oh, no, I want a real thing. I want a real Abernathy."
We have more children here in this picture. You have two sons right here. Who are they?
Yes, that is Kwame Letuli, 18-year-old student at Williams College in Massachusetts now, and Ralph David Abernathy III. He is a member of the state legislature in Georgia.
Ralph David Abernathy, our guest, and the name of the book is And the Walls Came Tumbling Down. Where did you get the title?
Well, I just thought about it and finally concluded to use the old spiritual. Joshua fit the battle of Jericho. Jericho, Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down.
Did you write this yourself, or did you have help?
No, I wrote it myself. And naturally, I had editorial assistance and suggestions, and I had a research person who checked out the dates for accuracy, and who assisted me in reading and grammar and spelling words and so forth. But it is my writings, my story, my words, and the walls came tumbling down.
How did you write it? Did you write it on a typewriter, longhand, or a computer, or how?
Sometimes I wrote it from on a legal pad in longhand, and I used to talk into a tape recording machine, and the secretary would lift it from there, and I would use various means. No, I cannot operate a computer. I was not blessed with any such skills, and I had to deal with the talking into a tape recorder or writing it in longhand. And I have my own type type of shorthand. You know, you have to write when you feel like writing, inspired to write. I have to write my sermons like that. So often my wife says to me, you know, Ralph, if you complete your sermon, then we can go out, you know, and to a party, visit some friends, but you don't write. I don't write like that. I had to wait for the moment of inspiration to come, and I can work long hours, way until the wee hours of the morning. Often I sat up all night long. Did
you write from memory, or had you kept notes over the years?
I had kept notes over the years, and but mainly memory, as I acknowledged in the introduction. The Bible was written by many inspired men of God, but the life of Jesus is recorded in what is referred to as the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And they give the life of the birth, the crucifixion, and the resurrection and ascension of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. But they all tell it in a different way. And I wrote it from my perspective, and I told it to the best of my ability. And memory sometimes fail, but I had a person to check me on accurate dates, especially the New York Times.
There are 638 pages, including the index in this book. And as you well know, 3 pages out of this book have been the focus of attention: the night before Martin Luther King was murdered. Are you surprised that only those 3 pages have been the subject of all the attention for this book?
I'm greatly surprised and disappointed.
Why?
Because to me, it is only jealousy. I didn't ask anybody if I could write my autobiography. It is my story, the story of my life. And you would believe it was the story of the life of my dearest buddy and friend, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And so it is not his story, but it is my story. And the second reason why I am surprised, they took these 4 pages and created a controversy. And they sent me a telegram and tried to get me to retract, falsely accused me of not having written the book, and demanding that I withdraw tell the publisher, repudiate this book. And I said, I cannot do that. And I went to Memphis on my first tour and promoting the book. And so when I got there, upon arrival at the Peabody Hotel, this young man from the Commercial Appeal, the only newspaper in Memphis, was there. And he was a black young man, and he said, Dr. Abernathy, I need to see you and ask you some questions. And naturally, I didn't want to talk to him, but he said it's very, very urgent, and I went up and checked in and went up to the room and came back to talk with him. And told me that the Associated Press had received a telegram that had been sent to me from the Martin Luther King Center for Nonviolent Social Change. And I thought that was very, very unfortunate, because the Martin Luther King Center for Nonviolent Social Change and is being very, very violent. And these people had not come to see me at all. Only the chairman of the board, Mr. Jesse Hill, had come to see me, and he came not reaching me, keeping me standing all day that Saturday and all day that Sunday. And on the Sunday, he brought a dear friend of mine who signed the telegram, and he just left on the message box of my wife's telephone that I should look at under the door, because they had left a message for me, the copy of the telegram that I would be receiving. And so I didn't, it was piercing and strong, and telling me to repudiate it. And I talked to Dr. Kilgore and to him the next morning, and Dr. Kilgore was in a very, very unique position, because he had enough love for me and my family, and enough love for Dr. King Jr. and his family. And he loved and supported both of us. And he was now in North Carolina, and he hooked, Jesse Hill hooked me into Dr. King, Dr. Kilgore, and we talked, and we prayed, and we prayed, and we prayed, and I agreed to receive calls from Lerone Bennett and from Bob Johnson, the editor of Jet magazine in Chicago, and the editor of the Ebony magazine. And since they were learned in that field of publication, and the next time I heard from Mr. Hill, he was telling me, telling my wife, that he had received the message that I was supposed to answer, that I was supposed to give in response to. And Lerone Bennett never called me. Bob Johnson never called me. And I didn't dignify what they were trying to say to me. If they wanted to reach me, my telephone is listed. The only black leader nationally, black leader in the country, I have a listed telephone, and you can look in the telephone directory and see the Reverend Ralph David Abernathy. And you can look in the telephone book under the Mary Kay Cosmetics section, business section, and my wife's telephone is listed, Mrs. Juanita Odessa Jones Abernathy. And so that is, I have always had the burning desire to be accessible to the poor people of this country and the poor people of this land.
Why do you think your friends, and there are a lot of people that are well known, Jesse Jackson was in that, I assume signed that telegram, and others, Why do they feel so strongly about you publishing what you say is the truth about Martin Luther King?
Well, I don't know. You will have to ask them. I cannot answer that question.
They help sales? Are you selling more books because of all the controversy?
No, I don't know. I have not been in contact with the Hop and Roll. I just heard that they have ordered some more books, but I don't know how the sales of these books are going and whether they are helping or hurting. I just don't know.
What do you think of the way the media has treated you, the interviews you've had? Have they been fair?
No, a lot of people ask me the same old questions. There it goes again. The same question over and over again. And Bryant Gumbel from NBC, my brother, who is my hero, I marched hard and long for him to have the host to today's show. And he, 1 week prior to my appearance on NBC, had come to Atlanta and taped in an interview with me and had not even mentioned anything about Martin Luther King womanizing and everything, but he wanted me to come to New York last Friday, and I went to New York, and I told him, you know, why come to Atlanta and ask me nothing about these pages, and nobody had asked me anything about Martin Luther King's womanizing. And if they had been shrewd, most people that read a book and buy a book, especially in the black community, they stop long before 435 pages. They don't read that far, and but they created a controversy, and so.
Why did you fly all the way to New York to sit down with Bryant Gumbel on the Today Show? Did he tell you what he was going to do, that he wanted to ask you about those pages before you flew up there?
No, he didn't tell me that. I was scheduled to go to New York and sign books and promote the book for Hop and Roll. And when I got there, just as I am in Washington today, I was invited to appear on your show. And so I was invited to appear on Phil Donahue's show. My wife and I were both on that show, and Ben Hooks was on that show. Roy Ennis was on that show with us, and the four of us dealt with Mr. Donahue. And the same day, and Jose Williams was invited, and I understand he had called me the Judas of the movement. And Jose Williams had always supported me across the years, and he had brought 30 pieces of silver, and like Judas sold out Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. Now the main thing, Martin Luther King wanted not to be a deity. He wanted to be just an ordinary man. He didn't want to be a saint or viewed as a saint. He was just a human being capable of becoming and producing and leading his people out of the wilderness of segregation into the promised land, saying to me privately, long before he said it from the Memphis pulpit, Ralph, I may not get there, but I have been to the mountaintop. take my people on across this Jordan to the land of Canaan, and I want freedom for all Americans. And he freed many white people and poor people who were black, American Indians, the native people of this country. And he was just a marvelous and fantastic leader. And I am surprised that they would center on 4 pages, and I didn't ever say that he had sex with anybody. I said that when I was awakened, he was coming out of the room with this lady, and maybe I don't know what they did, and he never told me he had sex with that lady, and he may have been in there discussing and debating and trying to get her to go along with the movement. I don't know the sanitation workers' strike. I didn't say that. And then I didn't say later that when we arrived at the motel, the Lorraine Motel, that he engaged in sex. I merely said that this Kentucky legislator was there, and when I discovered he was in good hands, I took off and went to bed because it was about 1:30 or 2 o'clock in the morning. I didn't try to dodge the issue. I wanted to tell the story where my book would have validity and not be thrown out by historians because they would say he has been dishonest in not talking about the life of Martin Luther King in its fullest extent. And so if he lies about one thing or looks over one side of the picture, the book is no good. I wanted it to be an honest and truthful book, and I told nothing but the truth, so help me God. I am not a criminal, and I challenge anybody to prove that the things that I said was not true in that book.
Right after this book was published, and right after the Memphis Appeal reporter and the AP and all started writing about that 4 pages, first thing we read was that you'd had a couple strokes and you had brain surgery and that something was wrong, and that's why you put it in here and didn't quite know what you're doing. Then after another series of stories, we read that Bernard Lee, who is written about as the only other man with you that night, I believe, before, isn't that correct?
Yes.
Bernard Lee's out here at Lorton Prison as a chaplain?
Yes, that's right.
But then you hear Bernard Lee being quoted saying that you were intoxicated that night.
Well, Bernard Lee is quoted as saying that he is the assistant pastor of the West 100th Street Baptist Church.
Where you were?
Yes, and where I am today. And Bernard Lee has never assisted me as pastor of the West 100th Street Baptist Church. And so he told in untruth. I have never been a drinking man. I have never desired even strong, a Coca-Cola is too strong for me, and it burns my throat. And I have never needed caffeine to wake me up. I have never been a smoker, and I have never been a coffee drinker, even if it is decaffeinated coffee. And they said that I have had 2 massive strokes, and I have had brain surgery. But thanks be to God, you can ask me any question about what happened in the movement. I was there, and they were not there. I was there, and I can give you an accurate account of what happened, because I was there and I was alive and I was awake, and I have never been drunk.
One last question on this particular thing. Why have your former friends, or you may call them still your friends, worked so hard at trying to discredit you? What will be, after the dust clears on this, what's the effect of trying to discredit you?
Well, I really don't know. For my so-called friends, first, they are so-called friends because they didn't come to see me. Out of the 25 or 30 people that signed that telegram, many of them I do not even know. And consequently, only, I guess, 2 people came to see me while I had these so-called massive strokes. Now, I am not paralyzed. A massive stroke leaves an individual paralyzed, or the mouth disfigured, or something like that. But thanks be to God, I have all of my thinking faculties and my memory. I talk slow, and I am not the wear and tear of the 63 years of my life has had taken its toll on me. But I have been on this show. You told me when I came in here that I came in here with the understanding that I was to talk to you for 45 minutes, and you told me an hour, and I'm going an hour, and I can go 2 hours, because I'm an honest man, and if you expect me to talk to you an hour, I will talk to you 2 hours if necessary, because Jesus says, when any man requires of you to walk 1 mile with him, walk 2 miles with him. And that meant, in my estimation, the 1 mile is required, but when you start walking the 2nd mile, he is embarrassed and he starts loving you and being kind to you. And Jesus was a nonviolent personality. But Jesus became violent on one occasion when he ran the people out of the temple because they were misusing his house. And Martin Luther King shoved a woman across the bed the next day because he lost his temple. People are just people. Human beings are mortal, feeble beings. And the Apostle Paul had a thorn in his flesh, of which he spoke about. And I could call you list of people. I'm staying at the Jefferson Hotel, but Thomas Jefferson had made some mistakes also. The father of our nation, George Washington, had made mistakes. The slave girls talked about his affairs, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I don't propose to know and be able to talk about these people, but I do not speak of him of them in this book. But I do speak of my friend, Martin Luther King Jr., and he would want me to tell it like it is and be honest and truthful. And I am not trying to hurt Mrs. King, because she knows it is public knowledge. J. Edgar Hoover had revealed Martin Luther King's lifestyle, and in the book I tell of visits that I had made on his behalf. And I'm not trying to tell the children, his lovely children, of anything about their daddy, because I love those children. And they called me Uncle Ralph, and they cited to me in the telegram that the Uncle Ralph I know would not do this. Yet they do all kinds of things, including sending me mail to my house, where they invite not my wife to the birthday celebration of Mahatma Gandhi. They are just always trying to ignore and rewrite history. If you go to the King Center, on the marches and demonstrations, and if you go to the Atlanta Hartsfield International Airport, you will see pictures of me and Martin marching together, and that somebody has cropped me off. They have decided that I am not going to fill my rightful place in history. And if they have the power to blot out my having been there by the side of Martin Luther King, they are willing. They have my permission to try to block me out, because I came as Jesus came, to preach the gospel to the poor, to heal the brokenhearted, to free the captives, to set at liberty those the bruised, and proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. I have been talking to you all this time and have not even taken a drink of water from this lovely cup that I'm going to take in and put in a lofty place, signifying that I was here today.
Let me ask you, and we're about out of time, your chapter headings are Atlanta, Albany, Birmingham, St. Augustine, Selma, Chicago, Memphis, Charleston, Martin Luther King Jr., and then you have a chapter heading Jesse Jackson. Now let me read to you the last paragraph that you wrote about Jesse Jackson in this chapter. Yet I have supported him twice in his bid for presidency. I assume that's 1984 and 1988.
That's right.
And I suspect that I will support him again if he chooses to run. Over the years I have come to love and admire Jesse, in part because he has matured into a great leader, in part because he has been so supportive of me. You go on to write, though, in the book, or you wrote before that in the book, about the night that Martin Luther King was killed. And the story that we have looked at many times since then, was Jesse Jackson there, and did he cradle Martin Luther King in his arms? And you talk about how you did, how close you were to him, and that Jesse Jackson, I haven't got the quotes here right in front of me, was nowhere around right after the shot was fired. How much admiration is there from Jesse Jackson to you? And after this episode, where he has denounced you and what you said here, do you think you're still supporting him next time he runs for president?
Well, Jesse Jackson is a good man, and he has shown amazing growth in his maturity, as we all. He was young then, but he did not cradle Martin Luther King. He was down in the courtyard And his first reaction was to call Mrs. King and notify her that he had been shot. But I rushed to the side of Martin Luther King and I cradled him in my arms. And Bernard Lee, I want you to ask him, did not I and he commit civil disobedience and stay in the operating room? And the doctor came over and said to me, it would be an act of mercy if God took him, because he would be a vegetable. He would be paralyzed from his neck down. And I want you to ask Jose Williams, where did Jesse Jackson get that blood from? The man that called me the Jesus, and the man who has supported me all of these years, and I have never done anything but tried to tell the truth and tried to be with Martin Luther King in all of his efforts while he was alive, and lived in Resurrection City right here in Washington, D.C., and built the Resurrection City and stayed in the mud, trying to keep Martin Luther King's dream alive of exposing poverty in this nation.
What's your favorite chapter? We just have a minute left of all the chapters.
Oh, my favorite chapter is the chapter Little David, the first chapter in the book, because I just love how my daddy, upon birth, when I was delivered by my maternal grandmother, Ellen Bell, he came home and made my name Little David. And I regret the fact that my sister later added Ralph, because Ralph does not have much meaning, but I love the name David. I was a little David, like Goliath faced, and I was able to do much to help Martin Luther King realize his dreams and my dreams and the dreams of all black people in this country.
Our guest for the last hour has been Ralph David Abernathy, and this is the book, And the Walls Came Tumbling Down, an autobiography. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so very, very kindly. Has too long ignored us, and the Democratic Party has taken us for granted. And so since all of my colleagues in Atlanta and various places across the country were supporting the Democratic Party, I felt that I should support Ronald Reagan. And so I understood very, very clearly that it is a policy in politics, according to President Gerald Ford, that you reward your friends, but you punish your enemies. And so I thought I would launch a job program and get help from Mr. Reagan and from the private sector as well as the public sector. You know, the Republicans have most of the money in the country, and I thought I would get that type of help. But he's soon forgotten what I had sought to do to him, or I cannot get through. And one of the distinguished journalists just happened to have been connected with my congregation, and I had to do her grandmother's funeral, and she told me, Dr. Abernathy, what you really should do to get to Mr. Reagan is to get to Mrs. Reagan, and maybe like that you can get through. But Ed Meese and the people surrounded him. I just felt that they never let my calls through and never gave me ample time to explain fully the meaning of the Foundation for Economic Enterprises Development.
Let's go back. I didn't mean to interrupt, but I want to go back so that the audience understands the context. You were asked to come and do a public hold up the hands and endorse President Reagan back during the 1980 campaign, and you did that. Do you remember the city in which you did that?
In Detroit, Michigan.
And you flew up there to do it, and when you got
Alabama, Ringo County, the heart of the Black Belt. And my grandfather and my grandmother were born slaves. And I just wanted to tell my story and to show the youth of America, the children of America, that you may be locked in poverty and you may have a difficult time surviving, but you can be what my dear friend Martin Luther King often quoted: if you can't be a pine on the top of the hill, be a scrub in the valley, but be the best little scrub by the side of the hill. Be a bush if you can't be a tree. And so you can be something and somebody if you do not lose your sense of worth and dignity and somebodyness.
I want to start with the last part of the book first, the epilogue. And in there you described that in 1980 you supported Ronald Reagan for the presidency. Why'd you do that? Reverend Ralph David Abernathy, author of the book And the Walls Came Tumbling Down, when did you first think that you wanted to write your autobiography?
Oh, about 4 or 5 years ago. I decided that I would write my autobiography, and I have been working on it ever since then, not straight out, but for given periods. I would write and I would leave it, you know, and go back to it and come back to it. And so I wanted to write this book.
You happy about it?
Yes, I'm very, very happy about it. I'm so pleased. It is a good-looking book, and it is a good book. And it is more than 600 pages of my life story. I am the son of a farmer, and I grew up in Linden, Alabama. Well, I did it for the simple reason, first, I didn't believe President Carter could lead the nation forward at that particular juncture. He is a good man, but I just didn't feel that you could run the country as he had ran the state of Georgia, and he didn't have around him the staff that was able to do that. And secondly, I supported Ronald Reagan because he was talking about jobs and income, and I went on with that side of my political life, and thirdly, I believed that young black people should participate in both parties, the Republican Party